so bright. Good evening. Can you hear me? And most importantly, back there, am I reading on? Yeah, good. Thumbs up. I'm Josh Ginsberg. I'm the president of the Cary Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the next of our Cary in the City conversations on ecology and ecosystem studies. For those of you who have not been here before, the Cary Institute is an independent research institute based in Millbrook, New York. We're about 100 miles north of the city. We focus our work in 4 areas: forests, I used to say temperate forests, but we've recently hired a couple people who work on tropical forests, urban ecology, which will be the focus of tonight's work, disease ecology, and everything from the factors that affect Lyme disease to Ebola, not COVID-19, although who knows, and freshwater and freshwater ecosystems. So we decided we would start this series last year because we were relatively unknown, and we wanted to change that because we'd like people to know more about our work. So thank you for coming. We're really grateful. And let me just introduce our speakers. Steward Pickett, all the way at the end, is a distinguished senior research ecologist at the Cary Institute. Some have described him, and I hope he doesn't throw something at me, as the grandfather of urban ecology. But Steward has been involved, yes, right, I know the feeling, with urban ecology since pretty much its intellectual inception. Next, we have Kristin Baja. Baja is what she prefers to be called, so I'm not being rude when I call her Baja. Baja is the director, I'm going to make sure I get it right, of the Climate Resilience for the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, works across the country with those people who are responsible for urban sustainability in cities around the country. And finally, to my right, we have Timon McPhearson. Timon is the director of the Urban Systems Lab. That was the part I wasn't going to get right, and a research fellow at the Cary Institute. So it's a pleasure to welcome them all here. This conversation tonight on on green infrastructure and environmental justice was catalyzed by a partnership between the JPB Foundation, the U.S. Forest Service, UC Davis, and the New School and the Cary Institute. And we have been looking for the last couple of years at the question of, is green infrastructure a global good? And part of what we are looking at is the equity issues, and that's sort of central to what we're looking at. I'd like to thank the JPP Foundation, a couple of whom are here tonight, for their support of this work. And I think we should just dive in. We will have time for questions at the end. All right, so if I flip this, I can do this. We're going to talk about, green infrastructure and justice issues, but I think it's important to start by defining our terms. Baja, one of the purposes tonight is to talk about justice. So could you talk a little bit about how we might define justice in this context?
Yeah, sure. So first, I want to acknowledge a couple things. So I go by she, her pronouns, and also I want to acknowledge my white body and my white skin because it actually offers me a lot of privilege in this world and in all of the spaces that I'm part of. And that's a huge part of, as we're talking about justice and we're talking about systems, it's an important thing to be able to do, to acknowledge our privilege in this space. And so I think when I start this discussion, it's acknowledging history. I'm going to go a little bit on a tangent. You'll wonder how this connects to green infrastructure, but don't worry, we'll come back. In history of just acknowledging that our U.S. Constitution was built to protect citizens, but at the time it was citizens defined as white male landowners. And those were the citizens. And all of our policies and practices were put in place to protect those citizens and use other citizens in order to advance them. So it is something to acknowledge as we're talking about doing justice work. We have to acknowledge history. And history is a big part because we have broken systems at all levels. Local governments that I work with, they are just part of this system as well. They're also broken systems. And so what we're trying to do is think about how are we doing corrective action? How are we thinking about this differently? And so when we start to talk about justice, there's all kinds of different elements related to justice and equity. And we're talking about things related to procedural equity. So how are we actually changing processes instead of just inviting folks to come downtown and have chat about a process that we've already discovered and we've already said, this is what we're doing for you. How are they part of the process? How are we going to people? How are we actually changing and articulating things differently? And then we're talking about distributional equity. How are we actually distributing things differently and thinking about the fact that we've been holding down certain people, and I will say people of color and Black people, for long periods of time, for generations. And in that, we've been putting people into harm's way and intentionally not investing in their communities and in their well-being. And so as we're talking about distributional, we also need to be thinking about how are we prioritizing the folks that we've been intentionally not giving resources to for long periods of time. And then there's a piece of here that's not on the slide above me, and that's around structural equity. And we need to be thinking about the fact that this is part of our institutions. It's part of our structure. It's part of what we're doing on an everyday basis. Redlining is structural, right? And it's something that's been integrated into our policies and practices. So I mention all these things because I think we could go into an entire night on equity and justice and have a full conversation there. But it's really important to have the grounding in that space when we're talking about environmental justice work and when we're talking about doing green infrastructure in a more just manner, because justice work is going to be really directly tied to racial equity work. And we also need to be thinking about the change of that process. And so one term I'll put out there and then I'll turn it over is targeted universalism. Has anybody heard of that? I'll do the show of hands. Thank you. Just one. But essentially, we're looking at acknowledging that all people's needs matter. Right? All of you matter. Everybody in this room matters. But that we need to be focusing on prioritizing our money, our resources, and our capacity in the areas that have been disenfranchised and have been intentionally held down by our policies and practices for decades. So we have an opportunity through green infrastructure and through environmental justice to do that and start to think about corrective action that way.
Steward, can you sort of put that in the context of injustice?
Baja,
if you want to
I
jump
love
in.
you. Go for it.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, maybe I should do a little anchoring myself. I'm wearing some West African mudcloth in honor of my ancestors who came from Africa, not on their own volition. And that's part of this deep history that emerges into the issues of injustice. And this country, as Baja has said, is just deeply, deeply designed to facilitate certain people's success on the backs of other people. And that continues today. It's not just history. It's not just legacy. And green infrastructure, and this is sort of the conclusion in a sense, but green infrastructure, if you just take the situations that we have and say, well, we need to green them. We need to make them more environmental. We need to make them more ecologically functional. If you just lay that desire on top of the system we get, guess what you get? You don't improve equity, you just reinforce the inequity that is so deeply baked into American society. So green infrastructure needs purposefully to be operated to facilitate justice and not accidentally or unintentionally promote injustice. That's kind of that's a big message.
So having defined equity and inequity and justice and injustice, or at least started to, Timon, could you talk a little bit about what we might mean by green infrastructure?
I got the easy job, I think, actually.
Certainly there's a diversity, but it's not quite so historically weighted.
Well, it's to some extent what we're here to talk about a little bit is how green infrastructure is in America already starting to reinforce the status quo, and what can we do about it. So let's talk a little bit about that. I will also acknowledge my whiteness and my maleness. Despite growing up poor in rural Indiana, I've had a lot of privileges, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone and you giving me the chance to be here. Green infrastructure is defined really differently. It's interesting that it means very many different things to many different people and to different city agencies, for example. If you just look at the way cities talk about green infrastructure, it's all over the place, right? In some cases, there's some narrow meanings that we find that are very similar that most of us can agree on, that green infrastructure is something like it's pocket parks and it's bioswales and it's rain gardens and it's green roofs. And that's a particular kind of framing, and it's generally framed around meeting a particular goal, which is to absorb stormwater. That's not all it is, but that tends to be a dominant framing. However, another very much broader framing is just to say it's the green stuff, as Steward was mentioning. It's the green things in the city. And so that's wetlands and forests and trees and parks. And so that broad framing sometimes can be in conflict with this other framing that's a little bit more narrow. But I think one of the most interesting things about it really is the word infrastructure on the end of it. So what is that about, right? Steward's been studying ecosystems in cities for an extremely long time, and that's something I think that the Cary Institute has done some amazing leadership around. So why are we calling it green infrastructure? And I think a fundamental thing is when we think about cities, most of the time when we think about cities, we think about the gray infrastructure. We think about the buildings, the roads, the bridges, the tunnels, the pipes, the wires, right? And so green infrastructure is a way to think about the way we can bring ecosystems into the conversation about what provides services in a city, what provides benefits for people in the city. The buildings, residential buildings, there's a very particular function there that to provide homes, places of safety. Green infrastructure also does that too. And so when we use it in that way, and this is something that has gone extremely mainstream in a very short period of time, it's very interesting to kind of talk about that a little bit more. It allows us to start to think about the way we hybridize ecosystems in architecture, as part of design, as part of planning. And that now is starting to take shape in a way that is thinking about those many kinds of benefits. And maybe that's, if I add one more piece to that, is the multifunctionality of that. Yeah,
multifunctionality, but also why now? I mean, why not all of a sudden, but over the last 10, 15 years, has green infrastructure become such an important part of urban planning? And why don't you take a first shot? And Baja, I think you probably could follow up on it now.
I'm sure everyone can.
All right.
Well, I think one of the things that is interesting is how mainstream it's gotten in such a short period of time. And if you look in New York, it was just 10 years ago that New York City Green Infrastructure Plan was put out. Now, billions of dollars in cities all around the world are being invested in green infrastructure. And what I was about to say is one of the reasons is because it, unlike a lot of gray infrastructure, which is often single-purpose design, it's multifunctional. And what we mean by that is that it can provide many kinds of services at the same time. One of the dominant framings, and I think this is sort of to your point, why has it gone mainstream, is with the rise of urbanization and climate change coming together on a bit of a collision course with so many challenges that cities are facing, we're looking for solutions. And at the same time, we started to realize just how dramatic climate change is in terms of the risk it's posing to populations, to critical infrastructure, risk like heat waves, extreme rainfall, storm surge like we've experienced, Hurricane Sandy in Baltimore and New York. We've been looking for solutions, and solutions that can be multifunctional. And so in the same time period, over the last decade, especially in the United States, but this is true in Europe and other places around the world, something we now are calling nature-based solutions, the idea that this green infrastructure can be a solution space that can provide many kinds of benefits. Policymakers, planners, managers, nonprofit agencies, these are all starting to take this on as a win-win, partly because it provides cost savings. It's often less expensive than other kinds of gray infrastructure, and for even a single benefit, let alone the additional benefits. Sometimes it's also more flexible and adaptable. It can recover faster after an extreme event. So these are all reasons I think that it's all of a sudden taking off and becoming so mainstream. And yet it begs the question that we started with is, what do we do to make sure that we're not reinforcing other kinds of inequities that we have in the city?
And you've got that combination of climate change, resilience to climate change, and then the question of as you design things to adapt to that, are those equitable?
Exactly.
Steward, you want to jump in?
Sure, because really a lot of the places that you focus on when you think about flooding or you think about the kinds of hazards, the kinds of environmental hazards that are part of climate change, or just in general. Many of those places are the traditional homes of disadvantaged people, either racially or economically. And it would be easy to say, well, just move people out. Just have them somewhere safer. But these are people's homes, these are people's legacies, these are people's social networks. So on the one hand, you've got the rationality of protecting people from environmental hazards. On the other hand, you have the social needs of helping people to maintain their social cohesion, the neighborhoods, the kinds of social structures they have, the community values that they have. So it's a really difficult balance.
So Timon, we are almost finished, I think is probably the best way to say it, with a 20, we're on our way.
We're getting there.
We're getting there. To looking at green infrastructure and equity issues in 20 different cities. And I was wondering, what is the role of equity? Is it common? Is it different amongst those different cities? And how does it affect how we think about equity and green infrastructure?
Well, as you saw on the slide before, there's this fundamental question we've been trying to get at, which is green infrastructure a universal good? And one of the ways that we decided to do that was to ask the question at a national scale and to say, how are cities addressing this right now? It's been taking off, money's being spent, things are being implemented, what's really happening? So one way to do that, and we picked 20 cities in the US, spread across nationally, and we looked at every single plan that says something about green infrastructure. And so some of these are comprehensive urban plans, some of these are stormwater management plans, some of these are resilience plans, sustainability plans. We looked at 120 of these plans. And that's a lot of pages, if you think about it. And there's some interesting things that we're finding, and you can kind of sum it up really easily. We asked this question, how is U.S. city planning for green infrastructure addressing equity? And the answer is that mostly it's not. I suppose we kind of thought that might be the case when we looked, but it's interesting, and one of the sort of summary findings would be that, say, 30% of all of those plans do say something about equity. So, it depends on if it's glass half full or half empty. I mean, we're making some progress, I guess, in that case. 30% do, but only 13% even bother to define it. So it says something about the level of discourse and commitment if you don't even say what you mean. So that's one comment. Another thing that we found, and now I have to look at my numbers, is a lot of these plans, as I mentioned, are really about stormwater management. That's the dominant framing of what green infrastructure is for. That's where most of the money is flowing. If you think about this in the case of New York City, have nearly $1 billion portfolio for green infrastructure just for stormwater management, right? In all those plans, where the dominant form is about stormwater management, which is about flood and reducing flood risk for people, a very small percent of those actually acknowledge that those risks are disproportionate, that some people actually face larger risks than others and more frequent risks than others. So the way in which that's even talked about in terms of what it's for is also quite small. And maybe if I add one more in terms of beyond this lack of really understanding differential risk as a justice and equity issue, is also getting to these procedural aspects, is in terms of how do they evaluate it. Only 16% of those plans actually have some kind of community evaluation. And of that small 16%, only a very small portion of those even look at social impacts. It's pretty much just biophysical, meaning how much rainwater is being absorbed. That's the main criteria. And beyond that, they're not really looking at it. So it does tell us, at least right now, and as I said, this is ongoing work, there's still a lot to do, that there is a signal that there is a problem that is maybe not so surprising, but it's also a problem with the way in which green infrastructure is being implemented in the United States.
So Baja, that's a formal analysis of formal structures, right? And we know that is just a piece of the pie, and that there's a very large informal sector, and communities function in ways that are not managed or directed necessarily by city agencies. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the way in which resilience and other urban green stroke sustainability issues have unfolded in in those communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Timon did a great job of acknowledging that we're intending to use green infrastructure to think about resilience and to acknowledge what we're seeing with big changes. So precipitation variability, the fact that we're dealing with sort of tidal flooding or king tides already. The bigger issue, though, is so much of the access, or what folks have access to at the local level, is a wide variety or range of toolkits. I've actually been in a meeting once where there were 42 people in the meeting, and I asked a question of how many people had created a toolkit for a local government on green infrastructure, and 40 people raised their hand. And then I asked how many people had worked with a local government before, and I was the one who rose my hand. And so there's an interesting amount of information that is coming out that I think the folks who are intended to implement are not necessarily understanding how they're supposed to utilize the toolkit, which one they're supposed to use, in which way. And so it's put into a plan, but plans are only as good as they're implemented, right? And so there's still a long ways to go, but I do think we're seeing some progress. And I'll kind of talk about the fact that, at least in our network, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, we're making sure that all of our members are being trained on racial equity, on equity, and how to actually operationalize equity into their work. We're making sure that it's not something that they're just going through and checking a box, that they're doing individual trainings over and over and over, and then understanding how their individual training is translating into their opportunity to alter their plans and to alter their projects. That's not something that changes overnight. And it's also something that's one individual in a city who has to then go educate a lot of other folks who are in charge of things like capital budgets, or whether or not there's going to be a decision made about a specific piece of property. So I think we're seeing that disseminate in ways that it's much harder to measure because it's not written down in a plan.
I was going to ask,
right?
how do you quantify that? Right.
And that's what's difficult is we want to be able to quantify everything, and often the things that are happening around relationships, coaching, understanding, a greater personal understanding, and then a greater understanding of the way to work with external partners to start thinking about shifting of our power to community members through sub-grants and other things within communities. A lot of that's really, really hard to measure, but we are seeing progress in that space. And I'll say we're seeing a lot more of the conversations happen. We're seeing a lot more of the acknowledgement happen. And then we are seeing more of these projects getting beyond just pilots and thinking about the opportunity of what are we doing with water quality, what are we doing the amount of water, and then also how are we thinking about human quality of life as part of that and bringing them all together. And that's an intersection that I think is also going to be very hard to measure for a period of time.
But that's encouraging because, I mean, it suggests that we are slowly starting to address the issue of justice. But, you know, I mean, why is it, I mean, Steward, you started at the beginning of this talking about some of the reasons that we have injustice. And I was wondering, you know, why is green infrastructure planning and management, you know, up until now failing with respect to justice?
One of the reasons is that our legacy of injustice is deep.
Yeah.
And it's built into the structures of how people have been able to accumulate wealth in this country. You see up here the redlining map for part of the New York City region. There were roughly 200 cities in the United States in the 1930s that were redlined. Well, it's not always red. There's green for neighborhoods that are thought to be secure for mortgage investment. There's the next level, B, which has different colors in different cities, usually yellow, for neighborhoods that are perceived by the local elites and federal mortgage organizations and the real estate industry, which was folded into this process in all these 200 cities, that were maybe a little bit risky. And then the third level, usually what's that? Again, different colors, much more risky. You're taking a risk if you offer a mortgage in this neighborhood, if the FHA has to support this mortgage. And then the red areas, which were said, just don't do this. This is not financially smart. This was done in the after the Great Depression to try to rebuild the property equity in the United States. And when you look at how people judged A, B, C, and D, racism is built into it, anti-immigrant sentiment is built into it. And those things, like those red line maps in those 200 cities, when we look at where are the trees today, guess what? They're not in B and C. They tend to be in A, and they're not in C and D. They're tend to be in A and B. If you look at where predatory lending happened in the early 2000s, where is it? It's in D. I mean, there's just redlining. It's like Faulkner. It's not even the past. It's certainly not dead, and it's a symbol. It's an indicator of just how pervasive these disadvantages are. And it becomes enfolded with all kinds of cultural signifiers. And those are the neighborhoods, the red-line neighborhoods, the C-graded neighborhoods, where sometimes people will go in and say, we're going to do you a favor. Here's some green infrastructure that will help the watershed. Maybe it'll help to cool your neighborhood down. Oh, but, you know, we don't really have money to maintain this. So would you mind doing that? So there are just some deep problems that are spatially embedded, racially coded, also coded with class, that are problems for our green infrastructure. We need to alert people to these. It's not just, people need to figure out how to engage communities. There's a lot of fear in those communities. There's fear of gentrification. There's fear of the relationship of trees and open space to crime. It's not always the case that those things are true, but there's fear, and you have to deal legitimately with people's fears. So that's part of what's going on. One of the things that we've discovered, again, in some cross-city work, that poor neighborhoods, neighborhoods of color, tend to be hotter, not tend to be, they're statistically, this is facts. They are hotter than white neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods. We've looked at all the biggest cities in the United States. This is a problem. Green infrastructure can help solve that problem, but you can't solve that problem if you just drop it in from above without taking into account procedural justice and people's fears and perceptions. So it's a really difficult problem, but it's an important problem, and you can work the solution, but you have to work the solution with justice as well.
Right. And even if you have equity, if you have unfunded mandates in those communities, some of those communities have the resources to address those, and other communities don't, and so you create an inequity.
That's right. If you put green infrastructure of type A all across the city, that's not necessarily being just.
It might be equal, but it's not equitable.
Right. Equality, equal distribution is not necessarily just.
Right. So equity is one of the things that limits the value of green infrastructure. Basha, what are the other things that are sort of making it difficult for this to work well?
Oh, I mean, there's certainly, I think, the big piece around the lack of trust of, based on what Stewart was talking about. I live in Baltimore. It wasn't just redlining in Baltimore. We actually had a white block, black block ordinance of 1910 that said white people may live on this block and no black person can live on this block. So when you go to Baltimore now and you say, wow, this block feels really different than the one that I just crossed the street, that's because of that ordinance. And even though it was something that was later kind of snuck into the way we did planning, it is prevalent, and it's been a huge piece about relationships and trust building. So when you talk about bringing in green infrastructure, it takes time to rebuild trust. It takes time to build relationships. And usually the timelines associated with implementing something, especially if it's connected to a federal funding source, are about a year. And so you have to run to get it done, and you don't have that time to build up that trust, to build up those relationships. And that's a really, really critical component. This is reparative action, right? We're talking about repairing relationships, building trust. And so the timelines are a huge issue. I think also beyond the federal level with those timelines, it's also something where right now at the federal level, the money is really going towards gray infrastructure. It's prioritized. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers likes hard gray, let's keep the water back. And so the funding doesn't flow the same way for the green, blue, gray intersection, or the opportunities to do things that are a little bit more advantageous over time. The other pieces, I think, get down to more of a neighborhood level. Maintenance, huge issue. We don't have the money built in for maintenance. And so a lot of times these things that we're putting in end up just becoming places for folks to throw trash. There's a huge education component. If we're not educating everyone in the community about what a bioswale is, or rain garden, or what this tree is doing here, it does get into that sort of fear of, what if somebody's hiding behind the tree, or is this where I'm supposed to put my trash? So it comes down to education, it comes down to communication, but really I think it comes back to the core issue around relationships and trust. And in order to really thoroughly build relationships and trust, we have to slow the process down. And that's a really hard thing to do.
Because it takes more than a year to build social capital. Yeah. A decade
I found
or two.
that.
Yeah, right. And so, so what are the best ways, or some of the best ways, to improve that and increase equity in green infrastructure?
Are you asking me?
Sure.
Go ahead.
It's for everybody.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's we've outlined some of the serious problems and the long-term issues, but how do we make it better?
Well, I think some things have been said.
Yeah.
We have to have budgets that have maintenance built into. We have to have things that move much slower. And I think there's a really additional tough piece there, which we just kind of hinted at, which is that there's also an urgency around these solutions, right? It's like on the one hand, we don't want to slow down. We want solutions in place yesterday, years before. We're behind the ball on dealing with extreme rainfall and heat waves, things that are increasing, and yet we have to find a way to slow it down to do it correctly. And so I think this tension is a really difficult one, but some of the work that you're engaged in, Baja, and others is the kind of thing that is starting to make some progress, I think, and we're seeing that in some ways. Steward, you mentioned this sustained engagement with communities, and you were kind of explaining this. I think this is like maybe the underlying message, but we've also seen some things like we could build into the process, into the implementation process, like having equity audits as part of the entire process of finding a way to message, whether this is from planning associations or to the city agencies that often are very responsible for the budgets, for the plans, for the implementation, to have equity at the center of what they're doing instead of a peripheral, or in some cases a mention or some part of the rhetoric, and to make that somehow central. And I think part of this is the challenge of how exactly to do that, to really make this rise to the center of what's actually being done.
I think it's also, there's a big piece of this of when we're talking about respect, right? This is going into somebody's neighborhood. And so when we're coming in with a design, or we're coming in with, this is the approach we're going to take, that's already been developed, or vote on these 5, it's a missed opportunity to really think about co-design and folks having an opportunity to feel like they're being respected as part of the process. Asking questions of, have you experienced flooding here? What is it like? Are you having problems with asthma? What do you notice about your neighborhood? Getting down to the basics so that we can make the connection in a sort of educational way about, this will improve your health conditions. This will improve your surface water. This will improve the fact that your car won't get flooded out if you drive through those big puddles. And here are the other ways we'd love for you to be involved if you have time. But the biggest thing is we need to be paying people for their time. A lot of us are being paid to be there and have those conversations and talk about it, and we're asking people to come and volunteer. And that's not being respectful of everyone and thinking about equity. And so how are we also reframing that to say this is a co-development opportunity where we're going to value your time, we're going to value you and make sure you're paid, that you have childcare at this, we're providing you with food, we're going to make sure it's in your neighborhood right here so we can walk out and see it together and we can explain some of the things. And also, I think there's a whole nother dimension of the idea of information as power and agenda setting as power. How we're thinking about shifting power as part of that and saying, how about you set the agenda for us? And how about you are the ones who are actually going to be the ones facilitating the meeting? We're here to provide some information. So there's lots of opportunities to build equity in. That's part of process, but then it's also part of co-design in other places as well.
Can I just add to that for a second? I think another part of the education is educating the decision makers, educating the city agencies. Like a lot of what you said might be new. But I also find that people are well-meaning. Most of the city agencies that I've worked with and the individuals, when you talk to the individuals, they are trying to do the right thing, but they may not know how. And so a bunch of the things you just listed are things that like they need to learn how to do these things. But there's also fear there too. And I think this also has to be acknowledged, this a fear of not knowing how to do co-production and what if it doesn't work, and the education of realizing that when you build people into the process, then they don't cut down the trees during the Million Trees project because they didn't want them in their neighborhood in the first place and no one asked them, right?
Yeah.
Then they are able to take ownership because it actually is theirs.
Exactly.
And so I think there's both an education that has to happen at multiple levels, and this is some serious work.
So, Baja, you work with a network across the country. Are there any cities that are combining, ecologically efficient and environmentally just green infrastructure, and who are the leaders in this, and what can we learn from them?
I think there's a lot of typical leaders, and sometimes I think it's those that have been given a lot of the extra resources and capacity to be able to take action, especially those that have been given a lot of money post-disaster to be able to work with. Maybe we're sitting in one of those places now.
Yeah.
I think that that's a great thing, right? We need to be able to utilize post-disaster funding to be able to take some of this action, and so I'm not criticizing it at all, but I think some of the more innovative things we're seeing is with cities that haven't had that kind of influx of cash to be able to try to do things in a more unique way. And so I know right now, actually, Newark is trying to take advantage of some of their funding to think about workforce development and actually focus on their green infrastructure, but it's around how are they getting in, bringing more jobs in, and how are they thinking about people at the center of that and training their youth to be able to not only put it in, but then to maintain it as well over time. The city of Phoenix is actually looking at, they were charting where people walk and the pathways they use to get to their transit. And so then they were prioritizing those corridors for where they're going to be putting in shade trees and shade structures so that folks have more shade. So I think there's a lot of innovation that's happening within the network of trying something new without a big bunch of cash. But then there's also your usual suspects who are doing amazing things. And so, City of Philadelphia has been doing a lot of great work in connecting their surface water management with sort of thinking about quantity and quality, and at the same time bringing in heat and thinking about their heat during the day and the evening spaces. I know that Portland, Oregon's been doing a lot of great work, and we work with a colleague who did an entire mapping so they could get down to the parcel level to determine for private landowners what sort of trees they could plant in ways that they could be part of the whole sort of green infrastructure system. So I could keep going. My network's awesome.
Yeah, it sounds awesome. We have a slide up of Queensboro Plaza, and Margie Ruddick's design there. For those of you who have spent time in Queens, go if you have not been out there since they turned one of the most dangerous sort of urban landscapes in New York City into a stunningly beautiful and accessible park, transit area, bike paths. It's really at a scale that is impressive. So I think that's why we threw that up there. So we've talked a lot about what cities can do, what communities can do. We got a lot of people in the audience here who are here because they care about this. And I'm curious whether all of you have sort of recommendations on what we can do as individuals to catalyze not just the addition of green infrastructure features to our communities, but how do we help make them just and equitable?
You want to go ahead? I can feel you on the right.
All right. One of the things that is really important about cities is that most of the land in the city is in private hands. And so that means that if we're going to make a difference with green infrastructure, either whatever its purpose is, whether it's for stormwater or for recreation or calming or biodiversity, all those many things, that we have to engage with people who run private properties, either private homeowners, landlords, co-op buildings, whatever, that these are the places where you can make a lot of difference. If you only have to focus on the public lands or the public rights of way, you're really disadvantaging yourself. So there's a lot of education there, that letting people know you are a part of the solution. What you choose to do in what little yard you have or what big institutional space you have makes a difference for the quality of everybody's life. So that's one thing. We have to engage with the people who control private property. And I'm not saying private landowners necessarily, because the people who control private property are not necessarily always the owners. So that's one thing. The other thing is that while you need to think about your individual parcel, the parcel that you occupy and can make some decisions about, what happens if you have a conversation with your neighbor or the people on your block? Can you do something in coordination to enhance green infrastructure jointly? So those are just some questions that may put people in a little bit different state of mind about what they can do.
I think I'm a little bit less maybe specific.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a real big piece for everyone in this room and everybody that you're talking to acknowledge that this work has to be done at an individual level. And then as we're doing that, we're recognizing our own positionality in the space, our own positions of power, our own privilege, and then what do we actually have capacity to impact. Mostly when I ask people questions about what are you in control of, what do you have power over, they're like, very little. But you're here in this room, so you have some positionality already, and everybody I work with in government has a position of power in some way. For some aspect, and that's the same in institutions. And so I think it's really important to note that we have to start thinking about, with corrective action, how are we shifting that power? And how are we getting out of maintaining the same things that we've constantly done over and over and over that haven't been benefiting our communities because we need to get it done quickly, because we have to meet a grant, because we said we put it into a plan. The ability to ask those hard questions individually, to then be able to ask those questions of others, and to change our process at the same time as we're changing the content, I think is really critical. And they have to happen simultaneously. And it allows us to also work, I think, across the silos that we tend to have. Green infrastructure is a great example of something that brings together climate mitigation, climate adaptation and resilience, and social equity if we do it the right way. But we can't just talk about doing it the right way. We actually have to do it the right way.
I don't know if I want to add to that. I think that was perfect. But I'll try one thing,
Okay.
which is, I think, just to sum up a little bit of all that we've talked about, at least for me, is to fundamentally transform our governance. And I think this is what we're all actually talking about, is how do we have a massive transformation in the nature of governance, that it's fundamentally democratic, that it's fundamentally engaged and co-produced and co-designed. How do we do that? I think everybody has to be involved in this in some way. And you're talking about personal agency. It's also about your network and who you're involved in. It's about who you support. And it's about us all talking about these things. And I think we're never going to be able to fundamentally shift. We're talking about green infrastructure tonight, but many other kinds of things that are bound up with reinforcing the status quo unless we fundamentally shift the way we govern our cities. And so for me, this is really fundamentally about transformative governance, which is not possible without us all getting involved. It's a transformation means it's huge, and it's doable We have tons of amazing innovations. We have well-meaning people on both sides of aisles, but we have to find the right ways to bring them together.
And I guess the optimistic piece of that is that our democracy often works best when we get more local, right? When people are involved, it's easier to get involved at a local level than a state or federal level. It's where you live. You often either know your representative or they find you at the subway station. But getting involved with the city council, getting involved with the mayor's office, getting involved with the community board, planning boards, and so on, all of that is possible in a way that is much harder at a national level. So I think that
Yes.
should at least make it easier.
Cities are our opportunity.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, where do we go from here, Steward? Shall we ask some questions? So there are a couple mics floating around. There are people with mics who will hand them. I have two things to ask. One, can you ask a question, not make a statement, just because we only have a little bit of time? And to the extent that we can get one question from somebody and not do a series of follow-ups, it allows more people to ask questions.
I'm just struck by the use of the language here, and I'm wondering if just by shifting it, it might be possible to address some of these issues. And that's just the historic use of the word infrastructure versus public works. And I just would put that to the panel, and if that might be a way for us to kind of address some of these things.
That's interesting. Are we taking a bunch? Is that what you want to do? How do you want to
No, we'll do one at a time. But
Okay, I'm just jumping in.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I don't hear anybody talking about public works. I only hear the word infrastructure when I'm talking to engineers, I'm talking to city agencies, resilience officers. So I think what you're suggesting is an intervention to shift that, but it's not a shift that I'm seeing or hearing. I guess we could talk more about that.
It's a historically situated word. I mean, you travel around and you see
That's
the word
true,
public
yeah.
works everywhere with respect to infrastructure, and infrastructure is a fairly new word. So I just was struck by the continued use of it with respect to these technologies and approaches.
I'm going to think about
So
that.
I have a similar question regarding vocabulary, and it's not a follow-on, I promise.
it's quite all right.
My question is around the word education. I heard that word used a lot, and education presumes that there's a font of knowledge speaking to an absence of knowledge. And given that I live in a red-lined community and I've been very active there, I would encourage you to think carefully about that. It shouldn't be, I'm here to educate you on what's good for you. It's more about what is it that you'd like? What is it that you want? How would you like to get it? How can I help? I think there's a real issue, and I hear this in my community all the time about outsiders coming in and educating us. And I'm wondering if that's really the word that you want to be using going forward. I've found that in my neighborhood, and this is a neighborhood of color and of immigrants, the way that I've seen change happen is by embedding myself. I'm not the outsider. I live there. And by actually actively doing things myself without educating anybody. I'm known as the trash lady because I walk down the block and I pick up trash. And people on my block would come up to me and say, "Why are you doing that?" And I said, "Because this is my neighborhood and I live here and I'm proud of it." And you know what? My neighborhood, my block has no trash on it because everybody else thinks twice before they throw it on the ground and they pick it up. And people come up and thank me. We now have trees in the neighborhood, not because I educated somebody, but because I ordered the trees and my neighbors see me out there when the weather is hot with my little tea kettle watering the trees. It's not about me educating. I haven't educated anybody. And so I really hope that, I'd like to ask you to rethink that term.
I'm going to jump in on that. It's with a great deal of pride that I report that my immigrant godson is the New York State Teacher of the Year. He works in the international high school, one of the international high schools in the Bronx. And one of the things that I have learned from him, plus actually our educators at the Cary Institute, is that education really is first and foremost and always a conversation. Where are people coming from? Where's their starting place? What do they know already? What do they believe? How are they situated in their world? And it's crucially important to be in that world with them. You're absolutely right. So if when we say education, you think about this top-down filling empty vessels. Please don't think that. That's not what we mean, I don't think.
And I would go to say the word engagement is very similar too, where it's this perception that we're coming in to engage on something that's already been developed. Language is really important in the space, and I think part of changing the process is establishing up front some, we call them guidance or sort of understanding that everybody's there with the best of intention, and that we need to be able to call each other out if there is a piece of language that's not working or something that does feel offensive, and everybody has to understand that it's a safe space, right? And so I think you're absolutely right that certain words just don't work well for certain folks, and other times it's a way that we're using the word that might be intended in a different manner. But education, engagement, all these other things of this perception that we're coming to do something for you. I call them a lot of times in the work I do in climate change disaster vultures, because they're really just there to quickly come in and fight over and then disappear and leave the rest of what's happening with the bones. And that's where we need the real work. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Quick comment on language too, just because Stewart used the word fear, and I think when we say a community is afraid of the things you listed, we're taking away their power. I think they're not afraid. They're very wise. They've had things done to them, and they've learned through generations and in their own experience. So I don't think it's fear. I think they're wise. But moving on from language, I'm so curious to hear, because more about the wealth creation opportunity in these communities through more just and equitable green infrastructure. The red line communities in the map you put on were helpful groundings, and I think what's part of that history is that we've stripped the ability for people in those communities to retain wealth and to really benefit from investments that are made elsewhere. And infrastructure is an incredibly lucrative sector. So could you give some examples of where you see some promise around green infrastructure and wealth creation in the communities where you're working?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned, I think with New Jersey, and I think we're seeing this in a lot of other places where we're focusing on not the idea of the green infrastructure, but what is the benefit for the members of the community first and foremost, and that's usually identified by the members of the community. So we want more jobs in this community, and these are the type of jobs that are desired, and so then the focal point is jobs, green infrastructure jobs, and opportunity comes from that. I think that jobs are intended and desired in most communities. That's a pretty common piece. And so I think that there's opportunity to bring that into all kinds of different infrastructure. I think these guys have some other thoughts, and so I'm not going to keep holding the mic. But one thing I will say is with the wealth generation, my big caution is then the gentrification that comes along with it, and sort of there's a big element of needing to be very careful around this being a wealth generator, because I think we see it in sort of the energy space as well. As we do retrofits, we change things up, and it becomes a gentrification consideration. So,
yeah, I was going to add to that. I mean, as soon as you said wealth creation, my red light bulb went off, because there's been so much articulation as a way to rationalize spending on green infrastructure, because it can drive up real estate values, because that can generate tax revenue, and because that tax revenue can, in theory, be put back into creating more green infrastructure. And it's a really nice cycle to imagine, except that changing real estate values changes neighborhoods. And so this is, I think the examples of job creation is there. And I'm not saying that's necessarily what you meant, but that's what I hear. And we're talking about language. And I think these are exactly the same kinds of things where people do need more opportunity, more resources, better job security, better energy security. But we do have to be careful about how that's done, because there is, I was going to say fear, concern about green infrastructure being actually a problem in the neighborhood instead of a benefit. And we know it has all these potential benefits, but it has to be done together with job creation, together with providing more low-income housing, together with providing stabilized rent control, so that you can shift that moving hard to move target of gentrification that's already coming. And I think that's probably the challenge we didn't talk very much about tonight, is that green infrastructure alone is part of the problem, that aloneness. It needs to be bundled with these other things, and that's what you don't see in the plans. They're not all put together, and we have to figure out how to do that.
Can I say one other thing? Can I say one other thing about that real quick? A thing about wealth, though, is also interesting is all of a sudden, and I realized I did the exact same thing as I jumped right into this idea of monetary and thinking about money. And I think, again, this is a piece I have to constantly remind myself of, how we're judging whether something is successful and good. And when we say wealth, there's a huge amount of wealth in just your health and the health benefits that we don't quantify in the same way, that we don't give the same type of value to. And I'm hoping that as we're starting to generate better benefit cost analyses and things like that, that we're incorporating those components. And sorry that I didn't mean to cut you off, but.
A lot of this is really to the point that green infrastructure doesn't operate alone, that benefit and hazard and burden don't act alone. These things are part of a system, and maybe that sounds trite, but we have in this country a system that needs to be taken apart and put back together for the benefit of everybody. And if green infrastructure is a problem for gentrification, if you don't take care of policies of zoning, policies of affordable housing, policies of quality education, policies that distribute jobs in ways that are useful to people who need jobs. I mean, this is a big, hairy thing that we need to be thinking about all the parts together. So if you just think about green infrastructure, then you can fall off the cliff of inequity. If you think about this system for benefiting people where they are, you are less likely to fall off that cliff.
Got a microphone back there? Yep.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. And my question is, how does ecology or these species that are picked in these interventions sort of interact with environmental justice? And how can we use nature like in playing with these same social aspects of green infrastructure? Did I make myself clear, or did I?
Well, we use it as part of a larger process that's aimed at improving people's quality of life. And that includes the quality of local environments. I'm maybe not quite getting the question, but I think you use it as a part of something that's aimed at people's quality of lives.
Maybe just to add, and I don't know if this is where you're going, but it's a place we haven't gone tonight, so I'll just throw it out for 30 seconds, which is, we're also talking about ecosystems. And they have their own complexity, and some of them work well because we kind of get them and know how they work, and some of them are terrible failures because we've sort of designed something from scratch and it's not really living the way it needs to be living. And so I think part of this is actually getting the ecology right as well.
And it can be as simple on a green roof as designing it in such a way that you don't have a monoculture, you have native species rather than non-native species.
Right, or it could be shifting our new green roof legislation to pay a little bit more money for deeper soils so that we can have more complex environments that can do more things for us. Yeah.
Right. So I think there is a relationship between the species diversity, which species you choose, and what you're doing, but it may not always. I mean, some of these harder green infrastructure projects have a goal and an objective that may not be related to the species involved, and the species may have functions, and sometimes in those cases, non-native species may actually work better.
And I'm going to bring my climate change hat in here for a second and just remind folks, too, that as things are shifting really quickly, that our hardiness zones are also shifting quite quickly. And so if you haven't looked up a hardiness zone map in a while, take a look online. And it's changing so rapidly that the things that are considered native are not going to be native in a bit of time. And so it's just really important to think about diversity of species, but also species that might be growing south of us and incorporating that as well.
We should have one of these on those words.
Yeah.
Hardiness zones?
No native.
Non-native.
Yeah.
Where's the next mic? I can't.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the map of Baltimore that showed inequity based on unregulated and regulated green infrastructure projects that were done by DPW versus NGOs, and kind of what that meant.
We have a strong Baltimore contingent here.
The Department of Public Works in Baltimore works really hard to make sure that green infrastructure, green stormwater infrastructure is distributed evenly across the city, and they are sensitive to the need to not disadvantage particular groups. Well, okay, Baltimore is largely black and white. There's a relatively small Latino population in Baltimore, but it's growing. And so the Department of Public Works, you saw their dots basically all over the city, and they're not differentiated based on race. They're in all the areas of the city. The NGOs are perhaps focusing on minority neighborhoods, which is, I mean, that's one of the things they do. They want to help in underserved neighborhoods. But one of the things that they do as a result of that is that they'll sometimes do projects that are small and that don't have to go through the city regulatory process. And what that might mean is that they're not, in spite of their good intentions, they're not thinking through the maintenance issues. The city is often assumed to be the responsible authority for any green infrastructure installation anywhere. And so how these fit into communities, how they fit into the work of the NGOs is not clear to the people. And you do see that the NGO installations tend to be in minority neighborhoods. And like so many of the installations, they don't have the resources for maintenance. And so this turns out to be a white elephant, if you will, a gift that maybe keeps on taking.
And Stewart, because they're not permitted and because they're small and escape the permitting process, one of the things we found in our recent deep dive in Baltimore was that the city didn't know about most of them.
The city didn't know about
it. That they didn't get into the database, they weren't acknowledged, and you can't even begin to think that somebody can maintain something if they don't know it exists.
And so to go back to the word infrastructure, what that means is that if you don't know about them, if you don't know how they fit in, if you don't know how they fit with each other or the neighborhoods, they're not a system. So one of the things we need to do in green infrastructure is make it a part of the larger urban system as we understand it, including equity.
So we have time for minus one more question, but let's get one more question.
She's had her hand up in the
yes,
front
she's
for a
had her
long
hand
time.
up for a long time.
Right here.
And he's my brother, so I can diss him.
Thank you. How do you guys see policies like the Green New Deal fitting into this equation with green infrastructure and equity? I'm really optimistic, but I'm also curious if you guys see any red flags.
I don't know if you're hearing this. I'm hearing a lot of talk about the Green New Deal and green infrastructure and how green infrastructure can become a stronger piece that threads through a lot of the strategies that are being articulated there. I have yet to hear anything really concrete that I can wrap my head around what it means other than people are talking about them together. So I don't really know where it's headed. I can be optimistic as well and to say this is a great opportunity for us to bring things like tonight's discussion and to say, you know, some of the ideas in the Green New Deal are about justice and equity. So if we're going to somehow be talking about green infrastructure, then maybe this is one of the amazing opportunities that can work at multiple scales, right? At city scales, at national scales, for really thinking about the way we can align the kinds of things like thinking of green infrastructure as part of a larger social, political, ecological infrastructure system, and how can that actually allow us to start to meet some of the goals of the Green New Deal through really figuring this part out, right? Mm-hmm. I think there's something to be optimistic about there, but I haven't heard very much really articulated. But then again, I'm not an expert on the Green New Deal, so.
I think there's an opportunity, though, to shape it in a lot of ways, right? There's still a lot of unknowns. There's still a lot of gaps. And so if we're talking about an opportunity, there's a massive opportunity to get involved in saying, this is what it should look like. This is how we can do this. These are ways we should be thinking about it differently. So I think if you have interest in that space, get involved, because right now is the opportunity. It is going through drafts and different ideas and different concepts. And so this is a real time to be involved.
So first I want to thank Steward and Baja and Timon for their work tonight. So thank you very much. I want to thank all of you. If you enjoyed this and you have friends who might enjoy it, please, retweet, repost, resend whatever we send you so people can learn about this. We really rely on word of mouth for this. And finally, I just need to say, it's WNYC Pledge Month, Pledge Week. So I'm going to riff on that and say, we do what we do because we love it, and we do what we do because we think it's important. And if any of you would like to learn more about the Cary Institute or support us, please let me know. But as they say at WNYC, it's not how much you give. We really are trying to build the base of support and the number of people who support us to have a broader base. So, whether it's $5 a month or $10 a month, we are happy for whatever you can do. And of course, I'll thank WNYC for the use of the green space. So have a good night and thank you for coming.